Arban, Lika, and Dryden were names whispered in fear. Across Europe, three men who built an empire of smuggling, silence, and untouchable power, shaping Albania's criminal underworld from the shadows while the world remained unaware. In the late 1990s, Albania seemed like a quiet, almost forgotten corner of Europe. Its narrow streets, lined with small, worn houses, reflected the daily routines of people who had survived decades of political turmoil. The mountains stood tall and silent, guarding villages that had seen little change for generations, while the Adriatic and Ionian seas shimmered under the sun, hinting at trade routes long used but rarely noticed. On the surface, life moved slowly, predictable and calm. Children played near the shore, shopkeepers opened their small stores, and fishermen carried their catches to local markets. Yet beneath this ordinary life, a shadow was spreading. A hidden world was emerging, one that would eventually transform Albania into a hub for smuggling, crime, and unseen power. The foundations of this underworld were built on necessity. After the collapse of the communist regime in the early 1990s, Albania was left in chaos. The government was weak, the economy fragile, and law enforcement unprepared to deal with sudden freedom and opportunity. People struggled to survive, and opportunities to earn a living were scarce. Borders that had once been tightly controlled opened almost overnight. What was once considered illegal, like smuggling cigarettes, fuel, or small amounts of goods, became a way to survive. Families and neighbors who had known each other for decades discovered that cooperation in these shadowy trades could provide more security than the uncertain streets. Over time, survival turned into profit, and profit attracted ambition. Old smuggling routes, carved through mountains and along rivers, once used for simple goods, began carrying more dangerous cargo. Weapons, drugs, and even human lives moved silently through hidden paths. The mountains, once seen as barriers, became conduits for illicit trade. The sea, vast and difficult to monitor, offered easy passage to neighboring countries. Criminal activity spread quietly, almost like an invisible web. At first, it was impossible for outsiders to detect. Law enforcement was focused on obvious crimes, petty theft, street fights, or small-scale fraud. The more organized, calculated operations thrived because they remained invisible. The people who led these early networks were not hardened criminals at the start. Many were ordinary men and women who understood the terrain, knew the local communities, and had family ties that extended across villages. Trust became their greatest weapon. Deals were made quietly, partnerships formed without contracts or paperwork. Loyalty and silence were more valuable than money. Those who broke the rules disappeared from the picture, often permanently. As small groups began to expand, their influence reached towns, ports, and eventually international borders. By the end of the decade, Albania's criminal landscape had transformed completely. The quiet streets hid secrets that few dared to explore. What had started as a means of survival had evolved into a network of power, discipline, and influence that the country's fragile institutions were ill-equipped to handle. On the surface, life appeared unchanged, but beneath the calm, the roots of an organized criminal empire were taking hold. Every quiet village, every narrow alleyway, every overlooked port became part of a larger system that would one day stretch across Europe. The ordinary and the criminal coexisted, and for many, the line between them blurred beyond recognition. What seemed like peace was, in fact, the beginning of a silent and unstoppable transformation. As the years passed, the networks that had quietly emerged in Albania began to grow with astonishing precision. What had started as local smuggling operations between small towns and neighboring regions transformed into complex, invisible networks that extended far beyond the country's borders. The architects of this system were ordinary people who had learned to survive in a world of uncertainty, yet they now moved with the careful discipline of seasoned strategists. Families, childhood friends, and distant relatives became the backbone of these networks, creating bonds that were nearly impossible for outsiders to penetrate. Trust was not given lightly. It was earned through years of loyalty and tested in silence. Betrayal was not an option, and anyone who violated the code simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. The early networks relied on a careful combination of secrecy and mobility. Smugglers used unmarked vehicles to transport goods across mountainous terrain, avoided official checkpoints, and kept records in their minds rather than on paper. Ports along the Adriatic and Ionian seas became critical points for moving larger shipments, often disguised as legitimate cargo. These operations required coordination, planning, and patience, yet those involved treated their work as routine. There were no flashy displays of power, no overt threats. Everything depended on invisibility. The groups that succeeded were those who could remain unnoticed while expanding their reach. Expansion into Europe was a natural progression. Italy and Greece were the first countries to feel the reach of Albanian networks, often through small shipments of contraband that went undetected in larger trade flows. From there, connections spread to Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, establishing routes that could transport people, drugs, and weapons without drawing attention. The networks did not advertise themselves. There was no need. Their strength lay in their silence, their ability to operate without leaving a trail. Each connection, each shipment, each new partner was carefully evaluated before trust was granted. Inside Albania, the networks also infiltrated legitimate businesses, using them as fronts for moving goods and laundering money. Restaurants, import-export companies, construction firms, and even small shops became part of the infrastructure that supported the underworld. Profits were reinvested quietly, often improving towns and communities in ways that made the groups appear generous or helpful. This blurred the line between criminal activity and everyday life, making detection even more difficult. Law enforcement and government officials were often left chasing small-time offenders while the real operations moved unnoticed in the background. By the early 2000s, the Albanian underworld had evolved into a sophisticated system that rivaled traditional crime organizations in Europe. Its leaders were invisible, their faces unknown even to those within the network. They communicated through intermediaries, used coded messages, and ensured that the true scale of their operations remained hidden. Success depended on patience, discipline, and the ability to avoid attention at all costs. Violence was a last resort, deployed only when absolutely necessary, because it drew the unwanted eyes of authorities and the public. The rise of these invisible networks revealed a new kind of power, one that relied not on force, but on control, strategy, and silence. By the time outsiders began to notice, the infrastructure was already too vast to dismantle easily. Albania's criminal underworld had matured into a system that was both flexible and resilient, capable of adapting to new challenges while remaining largely invisible. What had started as survival had become a carefully orchestrated empire, its reach extending far beyond the country's borders, and its influence growing quietly with every passing year. As the new millennium approached, smuggling in Albania transformed from a series of small, opportunistic operations into a vast and highly organized empire. What had once been simple transactions between neighbors and local traders became carefully planned ventures that spanned countries and continents. The business of moving goods, initially limited to cigarettes, fuel, and small commodities, expanded to include drugs, weapons, counterfeit goods, and even human trafficking. Every route, every shipment, and every transaction was designed for efficiency and secrecy, reflecting a level of sophistication that few outsiders could comprehend. The empire of smuggling was no longer a chaotic collection of small-time criminals. It had become a structured, hierarchical system with clear roles, rules, and rewards. Money flowed faster than law enforcement could track. Profits from these illicit operations were immense, and leaders quickly realized that wealth alone was not enough. They needed influence. Cash was invested into legitimate businesses, turning ordinary shops, construction firms, and shipping companies into fronts for laundering and reinvesting profits. The visibility of these enterprises created a paradox. The networks became part of the public landscape while remaining untouchable. Authorities often saw only the surface, mistaking business success for legitimacy, while the real operations continued behind closed doors. This integration of crime into the everyday economy allowed the underworld to expand with minimal disruption. The scale of smuggling operations grew with alarming speed. Port cities like Durs and Vlor became crucial hubs, where cargo containers could be manipulated, redirected, or delayed without raising suspicion. Routes over mountains and through forests allowed shipments to bypass checkpoints entirely. Leaders studied logistics with precision, analyzing patterns of customs inspections, border patrol schedules, and international trade regulations. Each operation was mapped and executed with military-like discipline. Those who failed were not tolerated, and loyalty was enforced with an unspoken but unmistakable threat. In this world, power was measured not by public displays, but by the ability to remain invisible while controlling vast networks of money and people. The underworld's influence extended beyond borders. Albania became a supplier and connector for European criminal markets, supplying drugs to Italy, weapons to Greece, and facilitating human smuggling to Germany and the United Kingdom. Networks were interconnected, and alliances were carefully managed to prevent conflict. Leaders understood that unity and discretion were more profitable than violence and spectacle. Even when disputes arose, they were resolved quietly, often in ways that left outsiders unaware of the true scope of authority. The transformation of smuggling into an empire changed the society around it. Communities benefited from investments, infrastructure, and jobs, creating a veneer of normalcy that concealed the underlying criminal activities. Fear and loyalty ensured silence, and as long as profits continued to flow, few questioned the source of wealth or the means by which it was acquired. The empire thrived in shadows, its leaders rarely seen, yet its impact was felt everywhere. The ordinary streets, quiet ports, and bustling markets were all part of a network that stretched far beyond Albania, an empire built on smuggling, secrecy, and careful, calculated power. By the early 2000s, the criminal networks of Albania had achieved a level of sophistication that made them both invisible and indispensable to the larger European underworld. Their reach extended into governments, businesses, and law enforcement, creating a system in which control, money, and influence were inseparable. What had begun as survival and opportunism had grown into an empire that defined a generation, leaving a legacy of power built on silence, fear, and careful planning. In this empire, visibility was weakness, and anonymity was strength, the most valuable currency of all. In the underworld of Albania, silence became one of the most powerful weapons. It was not enforced through visible brutality alone, but through fear, manipulation, and an unspoken understanding that speaking out could have deadly consequences. From the early days of smuggling to the formation of large, sophisticated networks, criminals learned that the less people knew, the stronger they remained. Witnesses disappeared without a trace, files went missing in police offices, and investigations were quietly stalled or redirected. In towns and villages, people understood the rules. Questions were dangerous. Observation could be fatal, and loyalty meant survival. Silence was more than a tactic, was a culture that permeated every aspect of life in the shadows. The enforcement of silence was subtle, yet devastating. Those who broke the unspoken code often vanished, leaving families and communities with more questions than answers. Rumors spread, but facts rarely surfaced. Fear was reinforced by unpredictability. Even minor offenses could result in permanent disappearance. Law enforcement was often powerless, hindered by corruption, limited resources, or intimidation. Investigators who pursued cases too aggressively found themselves isolated or threatened. and many quickly learned to tread carefully. Communities learned to adapt, creating an invisible agreement to look away and avoid interference. In this environment, silence became both a shield and a weapon, protecting the networks while controlling those around them. This culture of silence extended into the political and business arenas. Corrupt officials, whether motivated by fear or profit, chose discretion over confrontation. Evidence that could have exposed the networks often disappeared, and witnesses suddenly withdrew statements or refused to cooperate. Business owners who unknowingly participated in illicit operations were subtly warned to remain silent, while those who ignored the warnings often faced ruin or worse. The criminal organizations did not need to resort to open violence constantly. Their ability to manipulate, intimidate, and control the flow of information was enough to maintain dominance. Every quiet port, every unmonitored route, and every hidden transaction became part of a carefully constructed system of fear and obedience. The result was a society where truth and power became almost unrecognizable. Ordinary citizens, law enforcement, and even rival criminals had to navigate a web of secrecy and coded messages. Trust was reserved only for those who had proven loyalty, and betrayal was always punished. The absence of information made it impossible for outsiders to understand the scale and depth of the operations. What seemed like ordinary economic activity, trucking goods, opening shops, managing ports, was often a front for something far more dangerous. The networks thrived not because they were invincible, but because they had mastered the art of invisibility. By the early 2000s, the culture of silence had solidified into a system that protected the underworld at every level. It was a method of survival, a tool of control, and a source of power. Even as international authorities began to investigate Albanian networks, the lack of reliable witnesses and concrete evidence slowed progress, allowing leaders to maintain their grip. Silence had become a language, a code, and an unspoken agreement between criminals, communities, and sometimes even officials. It was the invisible force that allowed an empire built on smuggling, corruption, and fear to operate with remarkable efficiency, showing that sometimes the most dangerous power is not visible at all. In this world, the absence of words spoke louder than violence. The underworld proved that secrecy, loyalty, and fear could achieve more than open confrontation. Those who understood the rules thrived, while those who challenged them disappeared. The lesson was clear. In Albania's criminal networks, silence was not merely golden, it was survival, and in many cases, the only form of power that truly mattered. As the Albanian criminal networks grew in power and sophistication, their influence began to reach beyond the shadows and into the corridors of political and economic authority. The underworld had long relied on secrecy, fear, and loyalty to maintain control, but over time, it became clear that money alone could not secure lasting dominance. To protect their interests and expand their reach, the networks began infiltrating legitimate institutions, ensuring that power and influence extended into places where laws were made, budgets were approved, and decisions were enforced. Politics became a new frontier, not through confrontation, but through subtle manipulation and strategic investment. The connections between organized crime and political authority were often invisible to the public eye. Leaders used their wealth to quietly support campaigns, fund local projects, and invest in businesses tied to influential figures. The benefits appeared legitimate: roads were built, schools repaired, and services improved, but behind the scenes, these contributions were a method of securing loyalty and influence. Politicians, reliant on funding and local support, were reluctant to challenge or investigate the very groups that were stabilizing parts of their constituencies. This created a cycle of dependence. The underworld provided resources, and politicians ensured that legal and administrative oversight remained limited or conveniently blind. Corruption became systemic, but it was not always overt. Investigations were slowed or quietly redirected. Officials who attempted to challenge the networks faced intimidation or career sabotage, and laws were interpreted in ways that favored criminal operations. Even reforms intended to strengthen governance were often diluted or delayed. The result was a political system where criminal and legal authority overlapped, yet neither side was fully visible to the other. Decisions were influenced, outcomes shaped, and power quietly exchanged, all without the public fully understanding how deeply intertwined the two worlds had become. This integration of crime and politics allowed the networks to operate with remarkable resilience. Smuggling routes, financial transactions, and human trafficking operations continued with minimal interference because the structures that could have interrupted them were compromised or unwilling to act. Leaders of the underworld could focus on expansion rather than evasion, confident that their influence extended into enforcement agencies, customs authorities, and even local governance. The ability to shape policy, control economic activity, and protect assets without direct confrontation became the ultimate form of power. The impact of this infiltration was felt across communities. While some areas saw improvement through investments funded by illicit profits, the long-term consequences were far more insidious. A culture of silence and complicity spread, making accountability nearly impossible. Ordinary citizens were caught in the middle, observing improvements in infrastructure and services, yet understanding that the underlying system was controlled by forces beyond their reach. The line between legality and criminality blurred, creating uncertainty and mistrust. By the early 2000s, it was evident that the Albanian underworld had evolved into more than just smuggling and violence. It had become a parallel structure of power, operating quietly but effectively. Its influence in politics, business, and society ensured that attempts to dismantle the networks faced tremendous obstacles. The empire that had grown from mountains, ports, and villages now extended into the very institutions designed to prevent such power. In this world, control was measured not by confrontation, but by the ability to manipulate systems, shape decisions, and remain untouchable. The underworld had discovered that true strength lay not in visibility, but in its ability to quietly govern from behind the scenes, shaping the future without anyone realizing it. By the mid-2000s, the carefully constructed networks of Albania's underworld had grown into a vast, almost untouchable system, but even the most sophisticated empires are vulnerable to cracks. As smuggling and criminal operations extended into Europe, law enforcement agencies in Italy, Germany, Greece, and the United Kingdom began to notice patterns. Arrests abroad, financial investigations, and cross-border collaborations slowly exposed fragments of what had long been hidden. For the first time, the empire that had operated in near total silence faced scrutiny from outside its carefully controlled environment. The cracks were subtle at first. Small seizures of contraband, arrests of low-level couriers, and disrupted shipments seemed minor and isolated. Yet investigators began tracing these events back to Albania, revealing connections that could no longer be ignored. Financial records uncovered suspicious flows of money, offshore accounts, and investments tied to legitimate businesses, slowly painting a picture of the vast network. The underworld's greatest weapon, its invisibility, was being challenged. Leaders who had relied on strict discipline, secrecy, and the culture of silence realized that even the most loyal associates could no longer completely shield operations from scrutiny. As investigations intensified, internal tensions began to surface. The pressure of external attention forced leaders to make decisions that they had long avoided. Some routes were abandoned, some partners cut off, and some operations paused. The carefully maintained hierarchy was shaken as mid-level members feared exposure, mistrust grew, and loyalty was tested. For the first time, the system that had thrived on cohesion and silent obedience showed signs of fragility. Small mistakes, long tolerated, now had far-reaching consequences. The empire was not collapsing entirely, but the stability it had enjoyed for over a decade was under threat. The exposure also revealed the network's adaptability. While some factions crumbled under pressure, others responded with remarkable efficiency, reorganizing routes, shifting operations to less monitored regions, and reinforcing layers of secrecy. The ability to evolve became a survival mechanism. What appeared to outsiders as weakness was, in some cases, a calculated strategy to absorb shocks and remain operational. Even as international authorities pieced together parts of the puzzle, the most powerful leaders remained almost entirely untouchable, hidden behind layers of intermediaries, front companies, and loyal enforcers. The cracks in the system also had social consequences. Communities that had once benefited from investments in protection found themselves caught in uncertainty. Small businesses connected to smuggling operations struggled, and ordinary citizens became aware that the empire they had relied on was vulnerable. The fear that had long maintained silence persisted, but now it was accompanied by anxiety and speculation. Rumors spread more rapidly than ever, revealing the fragile balance between authority and chaos that had long governed life under the shadow of the underworld. By the late 2000s, it was clear that Albania's criminal networks, while far from destroyed, had entered a period of transformation. International scrutiny, internal strain, and the evolving nature of crime forced the empire to adapt. The cracks revealed both vulnerability and resilience, showing that the underworld was not invincible, but capable of survival through careful planning, secrecy, and adaptability. The stage was set for dramatic shifts in power, exposing the tension between an empire built on silence and the relentless pursuit of truth by forces determined to dismantle it. In this precarious balance, the underworld faced its greatest challenge yet: survival in a world where invisibility was no longer guaranteed. The fall of one major operation marked a turning point in the history of Albania's criminal networks. For years, leaders had operated with near-perfect precision, relying on secrecy, loyalty, and strategic planning to maintain control over smuggling routes and illicit enterprises. They had avoided unnecessary violence, maintained disciplined hierarchies, and shielded their identities behind layers of intermediaries and legitimate businesses. Yet even the most careful systems are vulnerable to mistakes, and the empire that had thrived on invisibility was suddenly exposed by a single, seemingly minor error. The operation that failed involved a shipment of high-value contraband destined for several European countries. The network had relied on a trusted route, one that had been used for years without interruption. However, unknown to the leaders, a key courier had been compromised. Perhaps through carelessness, or perhaps through external pressure, the courier's actions led to the interception of shipments across multiple borders. Containers were seized, records were traced, and law enforcement agencies in Italy, Germany, and Greece suddenly had enough evidence to connect the dots back to Albania. The impact was immediate and profound, shaking both the networks and the confidence of those who had believed the empire was untouchable. This failure revealed the sheer scale of the operation and the extent to which the network had infiltrated legitimate businesses and communities. Investigators began uncovering hidden accounts, offshore transfers, and connections between criminal leaders and political figures. What had once been invisible became suddenly visible, and the extent of the empire astonished even seasoned authorities. The revelation sent shockwaves through the underworld. Members who had operated in confidence now realized that even the most loyal associates could not guarantee complete security. The cracks that had appeared years earlier had widened, and fear began to spread alongside uncertainty. Yet the fall was not total. While some factions crumbled under pressure, others responded with swift adaptability. Routes were rerouted, operations temporarily suspended, and leaders took more extreme precautions to maintain secrecy. The network had always relied on redundancy and planning, and these tools allowed certain parts of the empire to survive. The failure exposed vulnerability, but it also demonstrated resilience. Those who adapted quickly ensured that the empire continued to operate, albeit with a heightened awareness of the dangers posed by law enforcement and compromised partners. The unexpected collapse also reshaped the perception of power, both within the network and outside it. Communities that had benefited from the empire's investments were forced to reckon with its fragility. Corrupt officials and business intermediaries realized that the protection they had taken for granted was not absolute. Even international authorities gained a new understanding of the sophistication, reach, and adaptability of Albania's criminal networks. What had appeared unstoppable was now known to be imperfect, a system capable of error, but also capable of rapid recovery. In the aftermath, the underworld entered a period of introspection and recalibration. Leaders reinforced rules, increased security measures, and tightened control over information and loyalty. Power in Albania's criminal world was not defined by invincibility, but by survival, adaptability, and the quiet control of knowledge and influence. The collapse of a major operation served as both a warning and a lesson. Even empires built on secrecy and discipline are vulnerable, yet the ones that survive are those that learn quickly and adapt even faster. Today, Albania's criminal underworld remains a force both pervasive and invisible, its influence stretching far beyond what most outsiders realize. The networks that began as small smuggling operations decades ago have evolved into a sophisticated system capable of surviving scrutiny, pressure, and internal upheaval. Its leaders continue to operate from the shadows, rarely seen and almost never publicly identified. Unlike traditional criminal organizations that often rely on bold displays of power, the Albanian networks thrive through anonymity, careful planning, and the quiet accumulation of wealth and influence. Their control is measured not by violence or intimidation alone, but by the ability to remain untouchable while shaping events from behind the scenes. The methods of the underworld have adapted over time. Smuggling routes shift as borders tighten, technologies improve, and international cooperation increases. Networks use a combination of legal and illegal enterprises to move money, launder profits, and maintain influence. Front companies, real estate, and even investments in legitimate infrastructure continue to mask the extent of operations, blending criminal activity seamlessly into the economy. The system has become highly resilient. Setbacks, arrests, or seizures may disrupt operations temporarily, but the networks are designed to survive shocks. They are not dependent on any single individual or route, and their strength lies in their decentralized, yet coordinated structure. Silence remains the most powerful tool. Fear and loyalty continue to enforce obedience, and those who attempt to expose or challenge the networks are met with isolation, threats, or disappearance. Communities and officials alike have learned to navigate this world cautiously, aware that too much curiosity can be dangerous. Even with growing international awareness, the true scale and depth of the underworld remain largely hidden. Intelligence gathered by law enforcement often uncovers fragments, but the full picture is almost impossible to assemble. Every transaction, every investment, and every connection is carefully guarded, making exposure rare and partial. The influence of these networks extends into the social and economic fabric of Albania. Investments in businesses, property, and infrastructure create the appearance of legitimacy, while also reinforcing loyalty and dependence. Ordinary citizens benefit indirectly, receiving jobs, services, or economic stability, which makes the underworld both feared and respected. Political influence remains subtle but potent, with decisions shaped by money, access, and pressure rather than overt confrontation. The boundaries between legal authority and criminal control are blurred, leaving observers unsure where one ends and the other begins. Ultimately, the Albanian underworld represents a system built on strategy, patience, and invisibility, Its leaders understand that overt displays of power attract attention, while quiet control ensures longevity. The empire is defined not by who can be seen, but by who remains untouchable. Its legacy is one of adaptation and resilience, showing that true strength does not require recognition or fear alone. It requires the ability to govern from the shadows, to manipulate systems, and to endure in a world constantly seeking to uncover it. In this hidden empire, faces are unimportant and names are rarely known. Power exists not in public displays, but in knowledge, strategy, and the careful orchestration of networks that span towns, borders, and industries. The Albanian underworld is a reminder that the most formidable forces are often invisible, shaping society quietly and efficiently. Its story is not about individual criminals, but about a system that has endured decades of change, pressure, and scrutiny, proving that control, influence, and survival can thrive even in the absence of visibility. The most enduring lesson is that true power can exist without recognition, and sometimes what cannot be seen is more dangerous than what is.